Yes, okay. Good evening, everyone. This is such an honour to be here. Thank you so much to you all for coming. Thank you to the Frontline Club for hosting. My name is Zoe Flood. It's great to see many familiar faces in the room and wonderful to see unfamiliar ones as well. I will introduce Judge Theodor Meron in full shortly, but I just want to add that it's a very meaningful event for me to chair and moderate here because we are not only friends and collaborators, let's say, of sorts, but we are relatives from the same family that was largely decimated by the Nazis in pre-war Poland. And so it's really amazing to be here tonight. And it's been a real honour to get to know and spend a lot of time with Judge Theodor Meron, or Ted, as I am unable not to call him, over the last decades of my life. So thank you so much for everyone for coming, Frontline for hosting, as I said. This is to mark the publication of Ted's memoir. Judge Meron, as many you will know, has an extraordinary career as both a practitioner and scholar of international humanitarian law. After decades spent as a diplomat, also as an academic, Ted has served as the president of multiple UN war crimes tribunals, has served as an advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, most recently working on cases relating to Israel Palestine, and has published extensively in the academic genre. And this is his first trade publication, which I hope you don't mind me saying is an incredible new start at the age of 95. I should add that not... I was about to say, I should add that not just is this a new start into the world of memoir, but this is also Ted's recent new start into the publication as a published poet, which his first book of poetry came out late last year. Which you can also find on Amazon. I'm just going to give you this because I think you'll need this. So first of all, there are many questions, and I will start with a number here from me, and then we'll open up to the audience. And I wanted to start off, I know that we talked about this extensively before you did actually write and publish a memoir. You didn't want to write a memoir. What changed? And I think you're going to need to use the microphone.
Sorry. My wife was a French Huguenot, was not particularly anxious for me to write a memoir. She did not want to be discussed in a book or in the press. She was extremely shy and timid. But when she died, I felt that I would like to write a memoir, largely as a legacy to her, because it was a marriage that lasted 42 plus years, and we were extremely close, and her death, sudden death, came to me as a complete shock. And what helped me really to cope was the fact that Oxford, where I have been for the last 10 years, has been extremely supportive and helped me get through that somehow. So I decided to write it, and it was not easy because I wrote before that something like 12 or 13 academic books, all of them published by my usual publisher, Oxford University Press. So when I started writing, I of course approached Oxford, and they said, "Terrible, bad luck, we don't do memoirs." And it took me, normally when I write an academic book, it takes only weeks to have it accepted. And this time it took me a year to find a publisher. I almost gave up. And it was thanks to Zoe's connections that eventually I found a publisher. But writing, it was quite an experience. You change the style, you change the way of thinking. You say to yourself, is this really interesting for the public at large? But when it happened, when it came out, I really was very, very excited to have, for the first time in my life, books in a bookstore. And I was at St. Pancras station, and they don't have a very large bookstore, and I was there last Friday or so, and I said to myself, let me ask. And there was a copy of the book. Not to be too happy about it, only one copy, but nonetheless. And before we continue, I really want to thank all of you for coming in this terrible weather. I was afraid we will lose half the audience.
Ted, so one of the reasons that I was probably annoyingly encouraging you to write a memoir was that aside from your extraordinary professional career, you, I believe, are one of the last people who lived in pre-war Jewish Poland who can remember that time and lived through the Holocaust and can remember it. You were 9 years old when the war began. You were 15, nearly 16 when it ended. How has it been for you to revisit that time? And how do you feel when you look at the world now compared to what it was like in 1930s Poland?
People speak constantly about anti-Semitism in Poland, but I must tell you that until the age of 9, when the war started, I was not aware of it. I went to not a Jewish school, a general school, a state school, and what I do remember is the fact that constantly Chopin was being played, especially his military marches and polonaise, and I was with children who were probably 80%, 70% non-Jewish, and I did not feel any anti-Semitism. And of course, I was lucky to be born to a comfortable middle class. So life was before the war was lots of fun, kayaking, biking. It was not usual at that time for people in Poland to spend summers in a hotel resort. What was much more common was simply to rent a house in a village, and that was quite an experience for me. One of the things I am telling in this book, I was always a mad dog lover. And in this village where we spent the last summer or so before the war, there was a very big dog. So I said to myself, this would be a great thing to ride on. Except that the dog did not very much appreciate that. He threw me down, and I still have a very big scar on my leg. And what was interesting actually about it, which I tell in the book, is that when you get a bite from a strange dog, there is always some danger, at least, of rabies. And my family, I'm sure, loved me dearly, but they felt it's too much of a trouble to go to the nearest town and find a doctor. So they said, let's hope that it will be all right. And it was all right.
And that possibly
or I would not be here.
that possibly is one of the first miracles that was referenced in the title of the book, 1,000 Miracles, that you did not contract rabies from that oversized dog that you tried to ride.
Actually, the title of the book, which I think is very, very, very good and reflective of many fantastic things that happened to me in my life, was suggested by Zoe. Why don't you tell them how you came to that title?
Well, thank you for the acknowledgement. I really appreciate it. We were discussing the book. You had a draft, and you had a working title, and I didn't think it quite encapsulated it was getting there. It reflected sort of what you were getting at, which was about this twist and turn of fate and fortune, and how so much in life is unpredictable, and particularly in the extreme situations that you lived through, that it was moments minutes, moments, seconds that changed your fate and fortune and meant that you could survive or not. And I was actually, you already were working on the draft and quite far ahead with it, and I happened to watch the Jesse Eisenberg film A Real Pain, about which many people will have seen, about two cousins who go back to Poland to sort of follow their family's story there, which is something that I have also done. And there is a line that's repeated several times in the film, including with an expletive, which I probably shouldn't mention here since there is a live stream. But when I mentioned a formulation of this to Ted, I said to him, this really reminds me of how you've described the luck and fortune and the twists and turns of your life, that you are here by 1,000 miracles. And that is how the title came to be.
Actually, what Zoe did not tell you, that specifically was the original title which I selected. She did not tell you that one of my great loves in life is Shakespeare. I wrote 2 books about him, mostly about Shakespeare and chivalry. And in Troilus and Cressida, there is this phrase which I chose as my initial title, the weather of my fate. My fate, the weather, because at least here the weather is constantly changing. So that would be the idea of constant change, the ups and downs. But I think that your title is much more catchy and much
commercially minded, possibly,
and much more reflective of things that happened to me in my life, which was really where the element of luck, a lot of unluck during the war, but since then was so dominant.
And to talk a little bit about the war, I mean, I will repeatedly encourage you to buy the book afterwards. There are plenty of copies at the back. But your wartime experiences were extremely brutal. You lost large numbers of your family, including your mother and your brother, your grandparents. You were not educated, formally educated, for 6 years of your life. Yet you have gone on to become one of the leading international jurists and international humanitarian legal scholars. Would you talk a little bit about that time and how it has felt to revisit it for this memoir?
I devote to my wartime experience, I believe, only 1 chapter. I did not want to dwell on this too much when I was smuggled out of communist Poland right after the war. For years, I did not want to think or remember Poland. When I decided to write the memoir, of course, I could not deal with that period at all entirely. What was very difficult for me as a child is the fact that in this period between the age of 9 and 15, I did not have any companions more or less my age. I did not have school. In the place where I lived, where we lived, in the ghetto of Częstochowa and subsequent in a labor camp, there were no books. So I emerged as a young adult, completely devoid of culture and education. And I tried desperately when I was lucky enough to have an aunt in, at that time, Palestine, who was the first professor of engineering in the Technical Institute in Haifa, and they arranged for me a visa. At that time it was called a certificate, and hired, they could afford it, but this was perhaps in a way a secret of my success. They hired a great number of tutors who taught me everything, because no school would take me, given the fact that I did not know a word of Hebrew, nor a word of English. I had no idea of, I have never heard in my life about geometry or mathematics or anything that you did not learn by the age of 9. And by the age of 9, the limit the parameters of your knowledge are fairly limited, as you can imagine. So during the war, I will not speak about that in detail. I had a number of extremely lucky escapes, and I think that the title which Zoe found is not only catchy and good for sales of the book, but also, in fact, quite true.
You give yourself a slightly less charitable description. Can I just read this very brief paragraph? My question is going to be, it looks from this point where we're standing that your life as a war crimes judge, judging genocide and seeking justice for those who have suffered and survived atrocity crimes, it looks from the beginning like it was written. However, may I just read this? Zvulun must have exchanged letters with Rachel about my future in Palestine. This was not an easy question. I was nearly 16 years old with no Hebrew, no English, no algebra, no geometry, a total ignoramus. They all thought, apparently, that some manual occupation which did not require a high school diploma would make sense. You end up in a car mechanic's workshop. But a few hours later sufficed to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had two clay hands and a mind that refused to understand even the simplest secrets of the combustion engine. My career as an aspiring auto mechanic was over by dinner time. All I can say is that auto mechanics' loss is the world of international justice's gain, because you went on, after your re-entry into the education system, to study law, and ultimately to study law at Harvard, and then to return to Israel and to work for the government after your several years studying law. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about how you came to have that job and what it was.
My job in the foreign ministry,
yeah.
You mean? When after Harvard, I was lucky enough to get, surprisingly for me, an invitation from Sir Hersch Lauterbach, who was perhaps the most famous international lawyer of the 20th century. The letter was extremely modest in the sense none of you probably were alive when there were still aerograms. Do you know what are aerograms? So when an aerogram came, I was still in Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts, when this letter arrived, and I looked very sick. It did not get priority in opening because it was so sort of not very attractive. But I opened it eventually, and it was from Sir Hersch Lauterbach, saying that I've been recommended by Richard Baxter, who was my professor and mentor at Harvard Law School, and they're offering me what at that time was a very generous scholarship to come to Cambridge. So I went to Cambridge, and in Cambridge I wrote my doctoral dissertation for Harvard, published my first or second article, and then I don't know how, but one day, and I tried to get an academic post in the United Kingdom, and there was nothing available. And then one day I had got an invitation from a very, very famous scholar who was the chief legal advisor of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and who heard about me from people at Harvard, maybe in Cambridge. And he asked me, would you like to work for our foreign ministry? And I would have preferred an academic position, but nobody wanted me. So I said yes. So I spent altogether about 20 years in the Israeli Foreign Ministry, where some of the stuff I did or wrote was not extremely popular in the Israeli establishment. And Zoe probably would ask me, so I better can mention it. If myself, in '67, right after the 6 Days War, At that time I was counselor in the Israeli mission to the United Nations in New York. I learned that the chief legal advisor is being moved as the number 2 ambassador to New York, to the United Nations. And I was sort of catapulted from a mere, before that, assistant legal advisor to the chief legal advisor. And one of my first sort of baptisms of fire at that time was a request from the Prime Minister's office via the Foreign Minister to give the government my opinion as to whether settlements on the West Bank, Jewish settlements, were legal or not. And so I wrote 3 pages, typed pages. It took me 2 days, but no hesitation whatsoever about where I'm going. And I said, I will not bother you with technical details.
You can find them in the book.
How true. And the conclusion was building civilian Jewish settlements on the West Bank would violate the Geneva Conventions. And that opinion was classified as top secret, and for years it did not come out. And it was in 2005, 2006 that first an Israeli journalist by the name of Tom Segev wrote something about it, discovered its existence, and subsequently a Jewish American Israeli historian by the name of Gershom Gorenberg was, I think, by mistake, on the part of archivists in Israeli state archives, given access to the floor or the shelves where he found my opinion. And of course he knew that if he asked somebody whether he can copy the opinion, the answer would be clearly no. So before talking to anybody, he took out a camera and photographed those 3 pages, which in a way became the 3 pages of which I am most proud in terms of my sort of legal output. And I wish the Israeli cabinet at the time would have followed my advice. I think had they followed my advice, the prospects for either peace in the area or reconciliation between Jews and Arabs would have been so much greater. But it was a great experience which I enjoyed, working for the Israeli government. And I must say that I was not aware of any vengeance or repercussions for that opinion. This was certainly the last thing that the Israeli government wanted to get from the chief legal advisor. This is not what they got. But a few years, 2 years later, 67, in 71, I was appointed ambassador of Israel to Canada. Was that related to my opinion, a sort of a golden parachute? I don't know. But in any event, it was interesting.
There are far too many phases of your life to cover in the short time that we have tonight. So I'll again encourage everybody to buy the book and find out about all of them in more detail. But perhaps we can fast forward to you ended up leaving Israel and moving to the US for a variety of reasons. And this also opened up a pathway for a subsequent career in your I think your third career as a war crimes judge, and then subsequently president of war crimes tribunals. What drew you after, I mean, you became a judge for the first time at the age of 71. It's
very precocious.
What drew you to that pathway, and why do you think your background mattered so much when you moved to the bench?
Well, before I was nominated by the United States as a candidate for judgeship. You have to be elected by the UN. Before that, I had some exposure to international crimes. The U.S. appointed me a member of the American delegation to the famous Rome Conference, which drafted the statute of the Rome Treaty of International Criminal Court. I was sent to a very critically important conference in Copenhagen called Conference on Human Dimension, where that happened at the time when Gorbachev tried to sort of moderate Soviet policy and introduce at least a modicum of human rights. So I had some background, and then I was a member of the actual American delegation to the Rome Treaty itself. So there was some background for it, but it was during a sabbatical year, which I spent partly teaching at Harvard Law School and partly teaching at Berkeley, part of the University of California in Berkeley. And at that time, because I had those contacts with the Department of State prior to that, I was asked whether I would help the State Department, which had a major litigation between the US and Iran on oil, so-called oil platform cases, whether I would help in giving some legal opinions. Which I did, which was a sort of a real nuisance, because I promised my wife that we would spend weekends touring the incredibly interesting coasts of California. So what I did when we traveled, I had a large yellow pad, and whenever I had an idea about those opinions, I would stop in the closest parking and would write those opinions. I would get back to Berkeley, and I would send emails or faxes with my views, and but nothing sort of historical happened during that time, except when the trimester was almost over. I had a message from the chief civil service, not a political lawyer in the State Department, saying they enjoyed working with me. What would you say about coming as Council on International Law? Now, one of the miracles. But it happened, and I could not just say yes, because I was on sabbatical for 1 year. So I had to get in touch with the dean of NYU Law School, in which I was professor for 20 years or so. And he said, no, that will be very good for us. It will be good for you. So I became one of their sort of senior counselors. And then during that period, the American judge, famous judge by the name of Patricia Wald, who was the judge on the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, had to step down because her husband in Washington, D.C. was quite ill, so she had to resign and go back. And the State Department made an announcement, we need a candidate for a judge. So I said to myself, nothing ventured, nothing gained. I did not think I will get it. But, and then the State Department was very professional about those things. They appoint a professional search committee, which is supposed to submit to submit a recommendation to the Secretary of State, who at that time was Madeleine Albright, was close to Clinton. And so I submitted that, and they are supposed to submit a recommendation mentioning 5 candidates at the short list, and come to a conclusion in the sense that they may recommend only one person. So they recommended me unanimously, that group. And but then it went to Madeleine Albright, and I remember I knew that this is being discussed on the 7th floor, which is the secretary's floor in the State Department, and the person who went with the recommendation, a senior civil servant, said, and he was very, very serious and never cursed. He came back and started cursing. He was a very conservative Catholic. He never cursed in his life. He started cursing. Look what she did to me. He shows me the recommendation, and the bottom line was, which was pre-typed, I nominate Theodor Meron as the U.S. candidate for judgeship, and so she crosses that very neatly. She had a very, very girlish, very nice, very clear handwriting, and said, I nominate XY. And the XY was a person very, very close to her, who actually was a very good man. And in the book, I don't say anything negative about him. But lawyers in the State Department felt that should he be nominated as a judge, it would pose a real problem, because his job in the government was demi-prosecutorial. He was supposed to find the bad guys and to try to get them arrested and delivered up to The Hague. So he would have to recuse himself from all the cases in which those individuals were involved. So in any event, I lost, and 2 months later, months later, the administration changed, and somebody leaked the whole story to Washington Post. Because it was leaked to the Washington Post, the new administration did not want to do favors to Madeleine Albright. So they decided to revisit the question, and revisiting the question resulted in my being nominated. And I found it almost, there is something in one of Shakespeare's plays where he says something like, this is the stuff that dreams are made of. That here I, having lost most of my family to the Nazis during the Holocaust, I not only became a legal advisor of the State Department subsequently, but was elected by the UN and became a judge who dealt very much with the type of war crimes and genocide and crimes against humanities that Nazis committed constantly during the Second World War to my family. And it was psychologically it was sort of interesting. You said to yourself, in judging, you cannot think too much about your experiences during the Second World War, because you would not be a real fair judge. You should judge without fear and favor, and that means that you put your own knowledge of war crimes, your experience with war crimes, your being exposed to war crimes, completely outside of the parameters of what you consider. And the 20 years, almost 20 years, that I spent at The Hague were the most creative ones I have ever imagined I would have. And this is part of the miracles that explains the title of the book.
Thank you so much, Ted. Perhaps I know that there is a huge amount of detail that could be spoken about your time at The Hague, as president, the longest serving president of the Yugoslavia Tribunal, on the residual mechanisms as an appeals bench judge. But one thing that drew criticism to you, and perhaps to follow on from your last point about judging without fear or favour, you were criticised for presiding over what people would describe as very high-profile acquittals that upset a number of victims and survivors groups, which had political consequences. Could you perhaps talk a bit about the role of a judge in a system where crimes are highly political, and why you have taken the approach that you have taken around the law?
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that the system, it's unavoidable, is very political, because you have communities, nations, religions, which come to The Hague trying to establish the legitimacy of their national narrative. They are the victims, the other guys are the villains. And the result of that, in simple words, that you can never be right. One of the parties, Bosniaks or Tutsis or Hutus, because I was also presiding the appeals chamber for Rwanda, one of those parties will say that you are not objective, you are prejudiced, in favor of the Bosniak or in favor of the Serbs or in favor of any of those. And I think that if you follow their expectations, of course the first victim there would be judicial independence, judicial impartiality. And this was not something that I signed on. I signed on to being extremely fair. International criminal courts are relatively new, because after Nuremberg, 50 years, half a century passed before additional tribunals were established. And the legitimacy of the tribunals rests on the idea of fairness, on the idea of due process. And if we lose those credentials, people will say, why should we pay millions? Because those tribunals are terribly costly to support them. And people would say, and that is still the view of many people, that if somebody is charged, is prosecuted by an international prosecutor, then surely he comes at least with a narrative of guilt to The Hague, and maybe he's really guilty. The presumption almost is not presumption of innocence. The presumption is almost a presumption of guilt, and that would make a farce of international justice, and I would not be willing to tolerate that. And since I have the world record of presidencies of UN War Crimes Tribunal, I was in a position to fight that. And one of the problems in this context, the key problem, is it all right to acquit people who have been charged with terrible crimes? I think that I always felt that part of the maturity of international criminal justice is in our ability to go against the current, not to take into account any extraneous agendas, even if some of those agendas may in themselves be very desirable. You just go by law and evidence, and nothing else. As a result of that, I was sort of responsible for a number of famous acquittals of top generals, ministers, etc. And one of them was a famous Croatian national hero, General Gotovina, in the war between Croats and Serbs. And he was convicted by the trial chamber of crimes against humanity and sentenced to 24 years of imprisonment. And this case, I presided the appeals chamber. We were 5 judges. 2 supported me on reversing the acquittal and letting him go right away, which is a very dramatic result in an international court with the whole press sitting there. And of course, all the Serbs there thinking you are horrible, and all the Croats thinking you are wonderful. It was a very strange situation, and that criticism of me, of that case and one more acquittal of chief of staff of the Serbian army in a different case. I lasted for years, and it was a very, very difficult period because judges, when they are criticized, one of the great legal traditions is that you do not answer criticism. You take it quietly, and you say, well, read the judgments, it's all there. But eventually, and again, 1000 Miracles, the case did not remain in the criminal, in the UN War Crimes Tribunals. It got to the International Court of Justice, which is also at The Hague, and it is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. And the Serbs, in their argument in that case, made a very strong ad hominem argument against me that I am guilty for that result and that the result is unjust. But fortunately, they made that argument, which forced the International Court of Justice to deal with it. And the ICJ, as we call it, International Court of Justice, unanimously decided that the majority judgment of the 3 judges was completely right, and there was no evidence to suggest that one should have gone the other way. But these were very hard years. Being a judge is maybe glamorous for some. It is an extremely solitary position because you cannot talk about what you are doing. You cannot talk sometimes even to the other judges. You preside over deliberations. The only people with whom you may share ideas are your own judicial clerks. So it was tough. But I did what I had to do.
I think something that we've spoken about quite a lot, I report quite a lot in my work on mass atrocity crimes, including most recently on crimes committed in Darfur, in Sudan, where there has been almost no accountability for the last round of atrocity crimes committed 20 years ago. And I have often felt very demoralized, and I do come to you privately, which I appreciate, and express my demoralization, and I am reinforced by your view that however difficult and challenged the world might seem at the moment, the value and the state of international criminal justice, the value is vital. And I think there's a very interesting chapter in the book, not that I'm teasing it for you to buy it afterwards, but I am, about the state of international criminal...
percentage before
I didn't sign an agreement, oops. I'm not a lawyer. there's a very interesting set of reasons as to why it absolutely matters that people like you and your successors and your continued work in the space continue to matter so much. And I'm not going to ask you about that because we're running out of time and I want to make sure there's time for questions. My last question to you, Ted. You have experienced so many miracles, and there are many in the book. I would say the day that you arrived home late to your family home in the Częstochowa ghetto, which meant that you weren't taken with your mother and grandparents to be executed. The fact that, astonishingly, you were booked on flight 111 from New York to Geneva that crashed in 1998, and you changed your plans at the last minute, to an astonishing other number of miracles that you mention in the book that have led you to this point, to this day, and through the career and life that you've had. You describe one thing as your greatest miracle, one person, and that is Monique, who I was very fortunate to know and get to know deeply. And strangely, I was actually in the room downstairs when I learnt of her passing in 2023. What did it mean for you to have that love in your life and to give you that moral compass in the work that you have done?
Well, it's a difficult topic to discuss. I think that in my book I give the gist of that. She was, I think I mentioned already, a French Huguenot, and French Huguenots were historically extremely prosecuted. Extremely prosecuted by people, monarchs such as Louis XIV and so on. She had an ancestor who died on the galleys. He was enslaved and spent time there. And what I found extremely interesting about the French Huguenots is that would they just say one word in French, j'abjure, I abandon the Protestant faith, they would be treated normally. I said to myself, if Jews under the Nazis were allowed to say a magic word, I convert or whatever it is, but to Nazis, it would not have helped. And she had not only a great love for me, but it's not of genuine interest, but she had a tremendous integrity, and she had great courage. And during that period of being criticized by the press and by people who were very sympathetic to international criminal tribunals for my acquittals, I seriously considered stepping down from, at that time I was running for my fourth term as president of the court, and either stepping down from my candidature for the presidency or from judgeship as a whole, because I find it difficult to take the constant criticism. And she said, no, over my dead body. If you do that, people will say you were wrong, and you recognize that you were wrong. You were not wrong if you think it was right. It was right. And if your colleagues want to shoot you down, you will go down with a bang and not with a whimper. And so I did not resign. But life without her is not the same. I think we are to...
Yes, we're ready to have a few questions now. There is a roving mic. And yes, it's just coming through to the front here. And I know, Bex, you will keep your question to the point, but if everybody could remember that, that would be fantastic.
Yes,
only one question, okay? Each.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was so fascinating. And I asked this from a place of complete ignorance of international criminal law. But
so are we all.
But so in Philip Sand's book, East West Street, he talks about the legal tension between genocide and crimes against humanity and how the two were developed, and how that to some people feels like a legal misnomer. And I was wondering, throughout your time, did you find it a legal misnomer? Were you drawn more to one than the other? Or did you find it actually, it made sense?
No, I don't find it a misnomer. We have several categories and they coexist. All of them are important. You have war crimes, you have crimes against humanity, and you have the crime of genocide. You have also, at least in a sort of fragile way, nascent way, the crime of aggression. I think that we need all of them, and we apply all of them when the facts support it.
Is there another question? Perhaps we can take two at the front together, so Ted can combine them. There's a mic just coming.
Thank you for your inspirational talk. Of course, genocide continues despite the phrase, never again. What can we do?
No small question there.
Well,
would you like to answer that, Ted? Yes.
I think that one of the ways to prevent the recurrence of genocide, the Holocaust was technically genocide, although the word genocide did not exist then, is to speak out about things that have occurred in the past, to be quite open in discussing crimes which are being committed today, and to make it quite clear that these are crimes which are so abhorrent to the international community that we will not tolerate treating them with impunity. These are difficult issues. You have claims of genocide being made basically for every conflict in the world. Some of that justifiably, some not. But we just have to be careful about respecting the law.
There was another question just here.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Meron. If I understand it right, the notion of international law is quite a new thing. It's not been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I imagine that during the course of your career, you've seen it consolidate as a professional specialty for lawyers. I'm just curious about the extent to which you were part of that whole movement to develop international law as a sub-branch of law, or whether you more accidentally fell into it.
This is a very good question, because when the first UN War Crimes Tribunal was established for the former Yugoslavia in 1993, the only thing that we had in terms of prior practice with regard to international crimes was in Nuremberg. Now, Nuremberg was extremely important, and if it were not for Nuremberg, we would not have advanced so rapidly. But Nuremberg had a very limited number of cases. And not only that, it was developed in extremely general terms. It was international law in its skeletal form. When we became judges and had to apply those things, we became right away sort of architects of modern international criminal law. We had to flesh out norms previously articulated in such a very high level of abstraction that it was difficult to apply them in international criminal law, because international criminal law exists with regard to very specific events, facts and crimes. So our role in sort of fleshing out, developing the law was extremely important. To give you just one example, when the war started in 1991 in the former Yugoslavia, at that time, much of that war initially was national and not international. And as you probably remember, or know, one of the main crimes which was widely reported in the press and in the media was the crime of rape, which was resorted to as a weapon of war massively and brutally. And I remember before I was appointed to the court in 1993, I wrote as an editor of the American Journal of International Law an article called Rape as a War Crime. but at that time, still this was not the general view. And then again, the idea of life is full of miracles. The very first case to which I was assigned at The Hague was perhaps the most important rape case that was brought to us. And we really, in that case, completely revolutionized the law on rape. So, for instance, instead of requiring violence, we based the law on absence of consent, which is much fairer to the women.
I think there was a question back there as well.
It's about the effect of impunity on international law, and how you foresee the practical relevance of international law in the next few years in circumstances where major Western powers, as I understand it, are not complying with their obligations from the ICJ's judgment in January 2024 on Israel's plausible genocide in Gaza, and secondly, where the members of the ICC are facing sanctions by the US and Israel for their judgments.
Let me just, for precisions, there was no judgment of the International Court of Justice on genocide.
Interim.
Well, the judgment is pending. So from the lawyer's perspective, it's still pending litigation. We don't know how it will come. But impunity, this is the critical issue, that big powers, and the US is not the only one in that respect, protect their allies from jurisdiction, from accountability. And this is something which is extremely serious, because rule of law requires equality of enforcement. Everybody, the law should be applied to everybody. Of course, the fact that the US administration has imposed sanctions on the International Criminal Court is a very retrogressive step, and I only hope that it will not last forever.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your questions and your time this evening. Ted will be staying around to sign some books. I hope that you take my repeated encouragement and buy a copy. It's definitely worth it.
I assure you that I'm not paying her.
I'm afraid that is true. Thank you again to everyone for coming. Thank you to the Frontline Club. The team from Hearst will be handling sales at the back. And above all, thank you to Judge Theodor Meron, Ted, for not only living the life you have, but sharing it with the rest of us.
Zoe, thank you all for coming in this terrible weather. And I very much appreciate this opportunity to speak to you.